Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now let's remember the African diaspora's truly great son, Marcus Garvey, the famous Jamaican-born black nationalist who created a Back to Africa movement in the US and around the world in 1914. Mr. Garvey became an inspirational figure for civil rights activists such as Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Nelson Mandela. He also, of course, helped to inspire reggae artists such as Bob Marley to infuse and politically charge their music with a sense of pan-Africanism. Today, his spirit towers over the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in the wake of the death of George Floyd and many more at the hands of the American police. And as the people of the black race become once again the object of renewed worldwide attention, we remember the great Marcus Garvey through the eyes of his son, Dr. Julius Garvey, in a moment.
But I have no doubt that Marcus Garvey, and indeed the 2,000 delegates who attended the convention, wanted more than just to fulfill the dreams of political freedom and independence of their peoples, important as that was. The promise implicit in the drive for liberation was that freedom would inspire the rapid enhancement of the quality of life of the African peoples, and indeed of all black people around the world, and banish the specter of mass poverty bequeathed to the African peoples by the long period of colonial exploitation. Alas, that has not happened. I'm an incurable optimist and believe in our capacity to reach these goals. And in doing so, I'm comforted by the words again of Marcus Garvey when he said, "The black skin is not a badge of shame, but rather a glorious symbol of national greatness." I am confident we in Africa, and indeed all black peoples across the world, can achieve the greatness which our forefathers, with Marcus Garvey in the vanguard, dreamt of, and for which some paid the ultimate sacrifice, if we work together. We can do it. May God continue to bless Marcus Mosiah Garvey, Mother Africa, and us all.
Marcus Garvey is a prophet, man. Marcus Garvey tell you that we must look to the east for the king. There's a lot of things Marcus Garvey say, and a lot of it come to pass. Some still live, and everyone see it. I mean, get more stronger, you know, in reality. As everything when say them time happen today, and everyone see it happening. Well played.
The legendary Bob Marley there, and before him, the president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, both of them speaking about Marcus Garvey. And I'm delighted to say that Marcus Garvey's son, Dr. Julius Garvey, joins me now from Washington. Absolutely delighted and honored to have you, Dr. Garvey. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just briefly, tell us about who your father, Marcus Garvey, was, for our viewers who may not be familiar with him, although I'd be astonished if most people haven't heard of him, because of course he was one of the most important black global figures in history.
Yes, that's quite true. Basically, in the first half of the 20th century, he was the major Pan-Africanist. In fact, from my perspective, and I think it's 100% true, he laid the foundation for Pan-Africanism, and it has come to be defined not just by him, but by people such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and others, Nnamdi Azikiwe, who were influenced by him. And his influence was present at the 1945 conference, Pan-African Conference in Manchester, which then from there brought Pan-Africanism to the continent of Africa. It was initially a diasporan effort, if you will. Those of us in the diaspora at that time looking back to Mother Africa, from which we had been disconnected, and trying to therefore recreate for ourselves a culture and a historical focus through which we could see the present and the future. So that was the birthing of Pan-Africanism, late 19th century and early 20th century. And Marcus Garvey, with his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, brought together the largest number of African people, certainly outside the continent of Africa, numbering anywhere between 6 million and 10 million, together in an organizational structure designed to, as he called it, redeem Africa and African people. He spoke of Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. And indeed, in 1927, he spoke of a United States of Africa. So he was very visionary in terms of what he saw. He understood the conditions of African people because he traveled extensively. He traveled not only in Jamaica per se, but throughout the Caribbean, throughout Central America, now to places such as Costa Rica and Panama and Honduras. And then he traveled throughout Europe, and especially in England, and saw, how the British functioned at home and how Europeans functioned. And then, of course, he was from the colonies, so he saw what was happening in the colonies and the disparity between both. And then he had significant contacts with African people. He worked as a journalist of the African Times and Orient Review. The editor was Dus Muhammad Ali, who was an Egyptian. And so he learned a lot about Africa, and he met a lot of African students. He was doing some law courses at Birkbeck University, and he was working on the docks in England to make money to pay for his schooling, and he met many African sailors. So he had a full understanding of Africans throughout the world, if you will. And then he came to the United States in 1916. And within a year, he traveled throughout 30 states to understand the conditions of African people in the United States. And he had formed the Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League in 1914 when he came back from Europe. So he brought that to the United States and ended up staying here after 1917, 1918, when he created the branch
Right.
here.
Well, let me just come in there, because, I mean, that's a fascinating story you're telling us. I can see your dog is also interested in hearing it as well, because his snout is slowly edging into the side of the picture. Well, that's brilliant, though. But of course, he was born in 1887 and died in the 1940s. And all through that period, black people in America were in bondage. So it must have taken a tremendous amount of courage for him to embark on the sort of things he did, not only traveling through America and Europe, but challenging the Ku Klux Klan with his projects aimed at empowering black people. I mean, what can you tell us about that?
Well, I think you have hit the nail on the head. Not only did he have the vision, but he had the courage and the commitment to organize people around the vision and then to stick with it in terms of propagating it and making it happen as a reality. So he was definitely a unique person that came to us as an African people in our time of need, because as you mentioned, the timing, he was born in 1887, and as we all know, the Europeans sat around a conference table in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 and simply carved up Africa and decided who would get what piece of the cake. So he was born, right after the beginning of colonialism and shortly after the end of slavery. So we were in these, dire straits. And he knew our history, so he knew that we were the first people. He knew that we were the first civilization, and he felt it was. And I think this is, you might say, how should I put it? His epiphany. He knew that it was his mission, therefore, to recreate African civilization, and that's what he set about doing. And he was not afraid of the consequences. He said, and I think I'm quoting him, he said, leadership means everything, pain, blood, and death. And so he was prepared even to sacrifice himself for his people. And he felt that that was his mission.
And of course, just talking about recreating the black world, I mean, a lot of the Garveyites, and there were a lot of them, I understand there were more than 50 million around the world, were dark-skinned and warmed to his message of self-love. Because, I mean, he said, love your hair, love your broad nose, love your dark skin. So in a sense, he was the father of black is beautiful, because blacks were being denigrated by white supremacy, who made black the worst and white the best.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, the concept of black is beautiful was something that was created in Harlem by his advocates, so to speak, or his acolytes. After his passing away, these were members of the organization who created that whole concept of black is beautiful. And, this was a way to celebrate who we are as a people, and to use, our own aesthetic values in terms of who we are as a people. And again, I mean, we are the original people, and he understood this. And the original hair is curly hair, and there is no gene for straight hair. You lose the curliness, and there's no gene for thin lips. You've lost the shape of your lips, and you've lost the shape of your nose when you don't have a nasal passage, so to speak, to breathe as much air as is necessary, certainly within tropical climates. And that was a modification in the Ice Age and the European climates. So, each group has to have its own aesthetic. And he did the same thing in terms of physical appearance. He did the same thing for our religion and how we see God and how we see ourselves in terms of our relationship to God. He said, take down the images of a white God and put up the images we will see God, even though we know that God is a spiritual entity. Everybody sees, God in a sense anthropomorphically. So we will look at God through the spectacles of Ethiopia, because everybody else looks at God through their own spectacles. So he liberated us in terms of the new religion that had been forced upon us, which was Christianity, and in some sense Islam. He freed us from both of those and said,
right,
God is a spirit. We don't need to worship him in somebody else's image. We can worship him in our own image.
Okay. Well, we've got about a minute before we have to take a break, but we can come back obviously and keep talking. But I mean, what was he like as a person? You are his son. What was it like growing up under such a towering figure? And if you keep it reasonably brief, we'll come back and continue talking about it.
Well, yes, please stop me whenever, because I'm fairly eloquent when it comes to my father. But you have to recognize that the last time I saw my father, I was 5 years old. I was born in Jamaica in 1933, and the family moved to England in 1935. My father was circumscribed by the colonial powers within Jamaica and felt that he needed to move to England, which was a large London, a large metropolis from where he could carry on the organization. So we moved there in 1935. Now, my brother developed arthritis in his knee because of the cold, damp climate, and the doctors advised us that he had to return to Jamaica. Otherwise, he end up as a cripple because the condition would worsen. So my mother brought us back to Jamaica in 1938.
Okay, let me just ask you to hold that thought. I apologize for interrupting you. We'll come straight back and continue talking. You're watching The Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Dr. Julius Garvey, son of Marcus Garvey, the famous Jamaican-born black nationalist. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolo. My current guest today is Dr. Julius Garvey, a thoracic and vascular surgeon who, in addition to being a respected medical doctor, is also the son of the famous Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, of course, is the Jamaican-born black nationalist who created a Back to Africa movement in the United States and across the world in 1914 and became an inspirational figure for later civil rights activists. To facilitate the return to Africa that he advocated, in 1919, Garvey founded the Black Star Line to provide transportation to Africa and the Negro Factories Corporation to encourage black economic independence. In 1922, Marcus Garvey was arrested for mail fraud in connection with the sale of stock in the Black Star Line, a move which was politically motivated. His son, Julius Garvey, who's my guest on the program, continues to work to secure an exoneration for his father for what he says was a false charge. And Marcus Garvey's son, Dr. Julius Garvey, is still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. We'll talk a bit more about all of that, the Black Star Line and the false charges that were preferred against him. But you were telling us before we went on break what your father was like as a person. Please continue.
Yes, as I mentioned, the last time I saw him, basically I was 5 years old. So that my memories of him are childish or childhood memories of, his presence, his loving presence, watching myself and my brother play in the living room or in the backyard, with snowballs during the winter, or taking me to the movies and buying me candy and ice cream and that sort of thing. No real significant dialogue in terms of any sort of Pan-African philosophy in that sense, just as a loving parent who loomed quite large to me as a child. And what I learned of my father, really, I learned from my mother, who really created his presence for us, both myself and my brother. I have an older brother who unfortunately passed last December, but she created his presence for us because she was really his right-hand man in terms of the organization, and she wasn't just his wife per se, and a mother of his children and giving him a family, but she worked for the organization. She wrote the woman's page for the Negro World newspaper, and she challenged him in terms of his ideas and so on, and he bounced his ideas off her. So she was a real partner in terms of his the whole Pan-African approach to our social, political, and economic expression. So I learned a lot about my dad from my mother, and I credit her in terms of my upbringing, and the same thing with my brother. He became an engineer, and as you mentioned, I am retired now, but basically a cardiothoracic and vascular surgeon. And she always stressed education, and she always stressed his ideas and his motivation, his commitment, and his Pan-African ideals. So that I grew up as an African, not so much as a Jamaican, but I was born in Jamaica, but I was an African born in Jamaica. And currently I'm an African living in the United States of America.
Well, that's a very nice way to put it, and thank you for that summary. But we were talking at the beginning of this section that you're working to secure an exoneration for your father over the false charge of conviction of fraud by the US government in 22 or 23. Tell us about that charge which led to his imprisonment and what you're doing to try and exonerate him.
Yes, basically the trial and conviction was 1923, and the appeal process, etc., took place after that. But he was imprisoned in 1925. But basically, it was a political trial because what had happened, and there's proof of it by internal memos from J. Edgar Hoover, who was at that time building up the FBI. And he said in his internal memo that there is a Negro agitator up in Harlem, and certainly we don't want him to be some sort of Black Moses. So we have got to find something, some way to get rid of him. And of course, in 1919, somebody came into the office asking for Marcus Garvey at the Liberty Hall in Harlem and shot him, at least shot at him, 5 bullets, 2 of which grazed him, one his head and one his leg. Now, that person was captured. The police got him. He was jailed, but somehow he was said to have committed suicide within 24 hours. So we know that somebody sent him, and somebody didn't want anybody else to know, because it was rumored that he was going to tell everything that he knew. And then subsequently now we had J. Hoover infiltrating the organization, the first black federal agent ever in terms of the FBI. Was hired to infiltrate Garvey's organization, and there wasn't just one, there were several. And so that there was an attempt to get information about the organization, to sabotage the organization from the inside. And then these charges that were brought up relative to the Black Star Line, if you understand what was happening at that time, in terms of commerce and industry, the only way to move goods and services really was by ship. And that was the method of transportation, and there was no aircraft in terms of being able to do that. So major industry had to carry merchandises from one area to another, by ship, in terms of across the ocean from one continent to another. So this was his idea. And it's not just a matter of getting a ship to take Black people back to Africa. That was not the point. The point was to manufacture goods using the raw materials in Africa, and to manufacture goods in the United States and in the Caribbean for distribution to Africans in those different areas. And as you know, at the present time, we have more than 300 million Africans here in the diaspora, and we still need that kind of ability to coordinate our activities commercially. And so this was the beginning of that, and the power structure, if you will, because don't forget that Marcus Garvey was a threat not just to the United States, but he was a threat to all the colonial entities.
Right, okay. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left, Dr. Garvey. Sorry to interrupt you before we have to go. So I want to get to a couple of things before we say goodbye. What would you say his legacy is today, and who is carrying the torch that he burned so brightly long ago? I mean, one thinks of the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, today, briefly.
Well, basically, I think we mentioned earlier, so many people have been influenced by him, including Malcolm X and Martin Luther King here in these United States of America. And all of the independent African Caribbean countries, their leaders were influenced by Marcus Garvey. So that we have a tremendous number of people who have been influenced by his philosophy. And I think what is needed now is not so much another charismatic leader in that sense of carrying the torch, but the organizational structure to be able to carry forward his ideas relative to our economic independence and our economic strength, as well as our political and social and creative activities, because our culture needs to be reconstituted. Because the basis of our culture is African humanism, which is totally different from scientific materialism of European culture. So we need to create our enterprises, our systems, and our nations based on African humanism, because that's what the Garvey concepts were all about. It was African humanism in terms of treating your brother as you treat yourself. It's the Ubuntu concept, which is very, very African. It goes back all the way to Kemet, which is the Maatian concept. So this is what needs to be recreated. And many people are doing it, people such as Maulana Karenga in terms of his cultural approach, people such as Mother Fiante in terms of Afrocentricity as a philosophy. And of course, many African leaders, the late leader in Tanzania, and of course,
okay, I'm
President
really sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Garvey, but we have to go. We're out of time. Dr. Julius Garvey is the son of Marcus Garvey, and he was talking to me there from Washington. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and the United States. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.